So I am Stan de Spiegelaere. I work for UNI Europa, and I'm here to talk a little bit, to introduce a little bit the conference today, because the conference focuses on services sectors and collective bargaining. And what I would like to introduce a little bit is why do we focus on specifically the services sectors and collective bargaining? What are some of the reasons for us that we think we need a really an adapted approach for this? So this is a small presentation that I presented, and the image that I wanted to use for that is like, if you think about service sectors and collective bargaining, it's like you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You know, like when kids, when babies are growing up, they have these games where you have to put the stars in the right shape, etc. What I'm going to try to argue, and I'm going to speak slower, Fiona. What I'm going to try to argue is that for the services sectors, currently the collective bargaining structures is like a square peg that you try to fit in a round hole. What is my argument? My argument is, one, service sectors are really, really big. Collective bargaining coverage, however, is pretty low. And the main part of the argument is it's the wrong shape. The way that we do collective bargaining doesn't necessarily fit the realities of the private services sectors because they have special characteristics which are not like the model of collective bargaining for other sectors. And then, of course, the last part is, what do we do about it? And basically, if you have a square peg and a round hole, if you see the babies, there's two methods, right? Or you force it in, you take the hammer and you knock down the square peg in the right hole, or you try to change the shape. And you try to think about how can we adapt both the structure, both structures, to think how can we make them connect. I'm going to wait for the translator. So the first part is, if we look at the private service sectors, we have to understand that this is the main part of our economy. If you look at employment in Europe, the percentage of employment in Europe that is in services sectors, we're talking about roughly 3 in 4 jobs. It all depends, of course, how you define the service sectors, but in any case, it's a lot and it is growing. We hear a lot of talk today about industrial policy. We need to invest in our industry. It's all very good. We definitely support that, but we have to realize that the jobs will remain, even with high investment in industry, the jobs will remain in service sectors. Some of the subsectors like commerce, care, and finance, commerce and care, only those are 13% and 11% of total employment in Europe. So we're talking about gigantic sectors. The services sectors, they add 60% of the added value in Europe, and they're very much integrated in the industrial sector. So if you want an industry strategy, you also need to think about what you can do in the service sectors. Second, unfortunately, if you look at collective bargaining coverage, it is pretty low in services sectors. So if you look at the average of the private services, we're talking in Europe, roughly 50%, compared to industry sectors, non-services sectors, 63%, public services, 75%. The line there at the right for you guys is the 80% collective bargaining coverage, and that's, let's say, the threshold or the target of the European Union. So if we want to get towards that 80% collective bargaining coverage, we need to look at how we can increase collective bargaining, not only in industry, but also and definitely in the weaker covered sectors, which are the services sectors. Not only is there a big difference between the sectors, but we also know that there's a big difference in collective bargaining coverage if you compare countries. And that's the second reason why we did this project, this bar service. We didn't only focus on the services sectors, but we also focused on a number of countries which have classically a lot lower coverage than some of the typical Western European countries. Croatia, Romania, Czechia, Slovakia, Turkey, they all have lower coverage than average. So if we want to get to this 80% line, we also need to look how we can improve collective bargaining coverage in those countries. Now, the main argument that I would like to make is I would like to show you with a number of figures that services sectors are not like non-services sectors. They have different characteristics, making the classic collective bargaining structures a bit difficult. If you look at the workforce, I would say the workforce is quite different. First of all, it's pretty young. In the services sectors, we have 10% who is between 15 and 24. 15 and 24 is pretty young workers. If you look at non-service sectors, that's 7%. If you look at the gender dimension, In the non-services, 77 is male. In services, we're talking more than half is women who are working in the service sectors. If we look at the educational level, we see that in non-service sectors, it's mostly, let's say, middle educated, while in services, you have a big lower educated section and also a large proportion of high educated. If we look at the number of colleagues, classically, in the industry sector, 43% has more than 250 colleagues, meaning that they are in an establishment with a lot of people, big factories. If you look at services sectors, 40% has less than 10 colleagues. This has important implications on trade unionism, on collective bargaining. Obviously, it's much more difficult to organize in a small section than in a big one. If you look at the career of the turnover of the employees, in non-service sectors, 45% has a job for less than 5 years. So more than half of the workers are in the same job for 5 years. If you look at services workers, the 60% has the job for less than 5 years. Again, this has important implications because by the time you become a representative, you need to be in that job for quite a while. If you look at typical and atypical employment, same thing. We see that in the services sectors, we see much more freelance work, much more, a bit more temporary work, but mostly much more part-time work. So the workforce, to conclude, it's not the same. It's different. We have much more young, female, low and high educated, few colleagues, short careers, atypical employment. What is the consequence of this? Is that if we look at whether they are union members or not, we see a big difference between non-services and services. In non-services, and these are estimates, very difficult to do, but the difference is important. In non-services, we have roughly 1 in 5 of the European workers who are in a union. In services, it's 13%. So that is not a lot. Not only are the unions less strong in terms of membership, their other power resources are also weaker. They have less of a bargaining tradition, difficult coordination because many fragmented unions, limited leverage points, and not a high strike capacity. We've seen, for example, that many of the services unions don't have strike funds. They don't have strike capacity. So the unions are less strong, and also the employers are quite different. If we do the research on the employers, we see that we have both, bless you, we have both a lot of micro companies which are too small to bargain, and we also have a lot of big multinationals which are sometimes too big to bargain with. They are a multinational company, they're much stronger than the union, so quite difficult to bargain with. Some union avoidance strategies and the absence, quite often, and we will hear this today, of sectoral counterparts, employers to bargain with. And last but not least, we think that the current rules on collective bargaining and representation don't really fit. We have in most countries threshold for representation. You only have employee representation as of X employees in a company, which is not really fitting with an SME economy, with an economy with a lot of small enterprises. You have national bargaining systems, but sometimes we see multinationals who work internationally and who are a bit independent of those national bargaining systems. You have company-based representation, but we see that in services sectors, people move companies quite often. And you have sectoral trade union organizations, which is good, but at the same time, we see that the turnover, people move from sector to another sector in the service sectors. So sometimes they need to move unions all the time. So what I want to say a little bit like this is it's as if the people who made the bargaining rules are living in a virtual reality. They're not living in the reality of a services economy anymore. So the argument that I wanted to make is services are central in the economy. Collective bargaining coverage is very low, but the current structures that we have don't really fit with the services economy. So what do? Are we going to use the hammer to knock it in? Are we going to say we ignore that, but we're still going to try to work with those structures? Or are we going to think, and I had to search the word in English, but apparently it's called a file. are we going to use the second instrument there to change the shape of the services sector or of the bargaining system to make sure that collective bargaining and services sectors, that they fit? And I think this is what we're going to discuss today in the different panels. This is what we're going to discuss today in the different panels on the different sectors from the different countries, to see what are some of the specific challenges and how we can change it, both thinking about the organization of the unions, the organizations of the sector, but also thinking about the organization of the collective bargaining system. So Fiona, that was my short introduction, and I will give you back the word so we can go to the first panel. Thanks for your attention.